Hello, this is chapter 8, the chapter 8 synopsis. Now, this chapter is very important. There are a couple, at least two, I would say, questions on the exam regarding chapter 8. So make sure that you really understand this chapter and feel free to contact me if you have any questions. All right, so in chapter 8, we're looking at the supply and demand curves. And so you're going to get a better understanding of the demand curves, the supply curves, what it looks like when these curves are in equilibrium, when the market forces are allowed to work like they're supposed to work without any influence by the government or regulations. Then we're also going to see what happens when there's a change in the quantity demanded, and then when there's a change in demand, and what causes a change in the quantity demanded, and what causes a change in demand. So on the exam, make sure that you understand all these components, and then that you can draw a graph that shows a change in the quantity demanded or a change in demand, and consequently a change in supply. So I'll be going over all that in the synopsis here. All right, so let's go back to this. So first of all, the economists use a simplified model to illustrate the basic supply and demand curves. So what we're assuming is that we have a perfectly competitive market with a single firm and a single product. So a perfectly competitive market means that it's really easy. It's easy for it's easy for companies to get in and out of that market. So competitors can enter the market easily and exit the market easily in a perfectly competitive market. A company is really a price taker, not a price maker, meaning that consumers will set the price. So just think about, you have a lot of commodities are perfectly competitive, but an example of a perfectly competitive market would be, you've got let's say you have 4 gas stations on each corner at an intersection, and they all are charging, well, I guess gas is what, $4 now, $4 or $5 a gallon. Let's just say $4 a gallon. They're charging $4 a gallon. If one, assuming that all gas is equal, that they're not saying that they have additives in it to make it better, but just assume all this gas is identical. The one who has the lowest price, let's say someone lowers their price from $4 to $3.95, everyone's going to go to the gas station that charges $3.95. So in a perfectly competitive market, you have easy entry and exit, and companies cannot really set the price. The market sets the price. So it's really easy to explain the supply and demand curves when you have a perfectly competitive market. That's why they're using that assumption. All right, so perfectly competitive market, single firm, and a single product assumption. Okay, so the supply curve illustrates the behavior of the sellers. The demand curve illustrates the behavior of the buyers. All right, so let's first look at the market forces will result in a market equilibrium in the long run. This is the graph on page 100. But let's back up for a second, and I'm going to get out of this sharing screen. And first we're going to look at the demand curve, which is on the graph on page 98. So let me stop sharing here and take a look at this demand curve. Okay, so with this demand curve, there's 2 demand curves here, but let's just look at, they're showing a shift right here. All right, so here's your demand curve. Okay, so you see here we have the vertical axis is the price. The horizontal axis is the quantity demanded. And so here's your here's your demand curve. So you might remember this from some prior chapters when we talked about the elasticity of demand. So what happens here is you see that up here, you're charging a higher price and less is going to be demanded. So here you would have at one extreme, you have $12. At $12, 2 of this product are going to be demanded. If you go way down here at $10, or excuse me, at $4, about 9 9 of the products will be demanded. So the higher, so a movement along the curve is called a change in the quantity demanded. A change in the quantity demanded can only the price will affect the change in the quantity demanded. And the change in the quantity demanded is a movement along the curve. Okay, so just make sure you remember that. So if we're talking about a change in the quantity demanded, the only factor that can affect the change in the quantity demanded is price, and the change in the quantity demanded is simply a movement along the curve. Price goes up, quantity demanded decreases, price goes down, the quantity demanded increases. The reason for this is because the curve is downward sloping. All right. Now remember, the slope of the curve can change. If you go back to the elasticity of demand chapter, if the slope of this curve gets steeper, it means that demand is inelastic, remember? That means that a price change is not going to cause much of a change in the quantity demanded. So think about cigarettes. If you increase the price of cigarettes, the quantity demanded is not going to decrease by that much, and vice versa. But if you have something that has very elastic demand, let's think of a really flat curve. So think about something that's easily substitutable. I don't know, chicken or chicken versus beef, or a brand, let's say a brand of coffee, brand of peanut butter or something, brand of chips. Let's say that Zapp's chips go way up. Let's talk about potato chips for a change and an example. So let's say well, Zapp's might not be a good example because people really are loyal to their Zapp's chips. So let's just say, I don't know, Frito-Lay versus Laura Scudder's. So Laura Scudder's chips go up. So people are going to switch. They're going to increase. They're going to demand much more of a substitute. So anyway, the flatter the demand curve, the more elasticity you have, and the greater change you're going to have in demand versus in the quantity demanded versus the price. So so if you think back to the chapter on elasticity, if you have something that has a very elastic demand and you want to increase your total revenue, remember you would decrease the price, because if you decrease the price, you're going to get this huge increase in the quantity demanded. So if you're trying to increase revenue and the demand is elastic, you decrease the price. If the demand is inelastic, like for cigarettes, you would increase the price because your change in the quantity demanded is going to be much less than the increase in revenue you're going to get from increasing the price. All right, so just remember about the slope too. Obviously, the flatter the slope, the more change you're going to get in the quantity demanded versus a change in price. If the slope is really steep, a change in price is not going to affect the quantity demanded very much. Okay, but basically this slope is considered to be unit elastic, where you're going to have the same change, graphically. If you look at the area, a change in the quantity demanded or a change in the price is going to reflect in the same, mathematically, in the same change in quantity demanded. Okay, so this is the demand curve. All right, and let me see here, just a second. Okay, so that's it for the demand curve. Next, we're going to talk about the supply curve. Here's the supply curve. The supply curve is upward sloping. So in this situation, a change in the quantity supplied can only result from a change in the price, and whereas a change in supply is going to result in a shift in the supply curve. So later on, I'm going to tell you what things will cause a change in demand or a change in supply, which is a shift in the curve. But right now, we're just talking about movement along these curves, which is only possible because of a change in price. All right, so in this situation, as the price increases, the quantity supplied is going to increase. And then as the supply decreases, the quantity supplied, as the price decreases, the quantity supplied is going to decrease. So if you think about it, if the price goes up, suppliers are going to supply more. Simply, it's as simple as that. If the price goes down, they're going to supply less. Okay, so this is the supply curve. It's up and it is upward sloping. Okay, now I'm going to go back to the notes. And we'll talk about the law of demand and the law of supply. All right. So the law of demand states that as price increases, the quantity demanded will fall. Right. So remember what I was talking about, a change in the quantity demanded. That's called the law of demand. So the law of demand tells us that is if the price increases, the quantity demanded is going to fall. The law of supply tells us that as the price increases, the quantity supplied is going to increase. So make sure you understand the law of demand and the law of supply. All right, now, next let's talk about equilibrium. So these natural market forces will result in a market equilibrium in the long run. And this graph is on page 100. So let me pull that up. Let me stop sharing again and pull that up. Okay, so if you take a look at page 100, and I made some marks here. Okay, so all they're showing here is you have the supply curve and you have the demand curve. And where the two meet, that's the equilibrium. So what this is saying is that for this particular product, the quantity demanded is 5, okay? And the price is $8. So that's your equilibrium. At $8, 5 of these widgets are going to be demanded, okay? So what happens if the price goes up? Well, if the price goes up, let's say the price goes up to $10. If the price goes up to $10 right here, then demand is going to go down to 3 and supply is going to go up to about 7. So you see what happens here? If the price goes up, demand is going to decrease, and so demand is going to decrease, supply is going to increase. So you have what's called a surplus. So what happens if you have a surplus? Well, the market forces are going to force the price down. So the price will gradually go back down until it reaches this equilibrium. Okay, now let's see, we have a situation over here. Let's say that demand, let's say that the price goes down. When the price goes down, demand increases, but the price has gone down, so supply is decreasing, and you end up with a shortage. And so if you have this shortage here, then gradually the price will go back up and it will reach this equilibrium. So you have these fluctuations constantly, but in the long run, you're going to have this market equilibrium. Now, if you remember back, I think it's either chapter 2 or 3 in that paperback book, when we talked about inefficiencies, how taxes and subsidies were an inefficiency. And we talked about unemployment, or we talked about the minimum wage, and we talked about rent ceilings. Okay, well, let's go back to that for a second and illustrate this. So what happens, let's pretend that this is the minimum wage right here. And this is the number of people in the job market. Number of people looking for work at the minimum wage. All right, so right here, let's just say the minimum wage is $10 an hour. That's the equilibrium. At $10 an hour, you have X amount of people looking for work. It's at an equilibrium. Well, the government comes in and says, that's not a working wage. $10 an hour is not a working wage. We're raising the minimum wage to $15 an hour. Okay, what's going to happen? Well, at $15 an hour, there's companies that are going to lay off people. There are some of these businesses say, we had 10 workers at $10 an hour, but at $15 an hour, we can only have 7 workers. So we're laying off people. So what happens to the demand for workers then? Well, the demand for workers is going to decrease. The demand's going to decrease, say, to here. But if minimum wage is increased to $15 an hour, some people are going to be motivated to go look for work because $10 an hour wasn't worth it, but at $15 an hour, they're seeking work. So the supply of labor is going to increase. Plus you have the layoffs. So if you increase the minimum wage, it's going to cause unemployment. It causes a surplus of labor because fewer people are hiring, but more people are looking for work. And so you can see how how government intervention or regulations can disrupt this equilibrium. All right, so that's an example of a surplus in the how minimum wage creates a surplus in the labor market, which is unemployment. Okay, let's do the rent ceiling thing now. Rent ceiling example, come down here. So let's say that it's New York, it's Manhattan, and rent is $2,000 a month on average. $2,000 a month, and there's X amount of people seeking apartments. Well, the government says that's too much. You can only charge $1,500. So at $1,500 a month, demand is going to go way up here. Now, you might have had to have a roommate at $2,000 a month, but at $1,500 you can afford it on your own. That might motivate you to get out of your parents' basement. So more people are out there looking for apartments. But think of the position of the landlord. Let's say I bought this condo years ago, or some apartment years ago in New York, or whatever. It's been in my family, whatever. And I've got taxes to pay. I have insurance. And maybe have a mortgage on it. $2,000 a month was a fair price, but at $1,500, I'm at a loss. So I'm going to sell it or take it off the market and just live there, maybe, or what have you. But for whatever reason, if you decrease the price of rent, less is going to be supplied. So you end up with a shortage. So there's a huge shortage. New York is an extreme example, but there's a huge shortage of properties for rent in New York. And that's because of this rent ceiling. And so that's an example of a shortage. Okay, so anyway, you can think of several examples, but I just wanted you to make sure that you know this for the exam, that you can draw a graph just like this and explain the law of supply, the law of demand. What does the demand curve look like? Why is it downward sloping? What does the supply curve look like? Why is it upward sloping? And that only a change in price causes a change in the quantity demanded or a change in the quantity supplied. And a surplus is up here when demand exceeds, a surplus is up here when supply exceeds demand. And then a shortage is down here when demand exceeds supply. All right, so this is a graph showing the equilibrium, shortage, and surplus. Okay, now let's go back to the synopsis rather, and talk about what causes a shift in these curves. All right, a change in demand is an actual shift in the demand curve. Okay, so other factors besides price will cause the entire curve to shift. So let's talk about the demand curve right now. So any other factor besides price, a change in price, will cause a change in demand, which is when the entire curve shifts. If demand increases, then the demand curve is going to shift to the right and demand will be higher at all price levels. If demand decreases, then the curve will shift to the left and demand will be lower at all price levels. So let's look at some of these factors that cause a change in demand, which is a shift in the curve. So these examples that I'm giving you are all causing an increase in demand. They're all causing the demand curve to shift to the right. Obviously, the opposite would cause it to shift to the left or be a decrease in demand. Okay, so let's look at the following factors that cause an increase in demand, which is a shift in the demand curve to the right. Okay, an increase in income for normal goods. If our income increases, we're going to buy more of basically everything. That's a normal good. And a normal good is a good that you buy more of when your income goes up. So that's pretty much everything, except for a few things which I'll explain down here. So if we have an increase in income, so think about COVID. Think about people getting all that stimulus money. A lot of people had increases in income, and demand went way up for a lot of stuff. And that's why we've got inflation now, one of the reasons. So anyway, so an increase, if your income increases, your demand is going to increase for normal goods. And normal goods are goods that you're going to buy, that you want, and you're going to buy more of when you have more money. A decrease in income, wait a second. Okay, so if your income goes down, demand is going to go up for inferior goods. So an inferior good is like things that you don't buy when you have more money. So if your income goes down, you're going to probably buy more generic products. You might buy ramen, you might buy Spam, you might buy, really cheap brands. So that's considered an inferior good. Not in our area, beans and rice is we like beans and rice, but in a lot of other areas of the country, beans might be considered an inferior good. So your demand for inferior goods is going to go up if you have a decrease in income. Those are things you don't want to buy if you have a good income. Okay. Third, an increase in the price of related goods for substitutes. Okay, what does this mean? If the price of a substitute increases, demand for that other good is going to increase. All right, so let me explain that. Let's say the price of beef goes up. The price of beef has been going up. So you go into the store and the price of beef has gone way up. So you're going to demand more chicken because chicken is a substitute for beef. Let's say that the price of, the price of orange juice goes way up. So you drink more grape juice or apple juice. And so if the price of one good goes up, the demand for its substitute will go up. All right. Likewise, a decrease in the price for complements is going to increase demand for a related good. So if you have two goods that are complements, and the price of one of the complements decreases, then the price of the other. If the price decreases of one item, the price of the demand for the complement will go up, right? So let's say peanut butter and jelly. Peanut butter and jelly go hand in hand. Let's say the price for peanut butter goes down, then that means that people are going to buy more peanut butter. They're going to buy more jelly because jelly goes with peanut butter. So if the price of peanut butter goes down, the demand for jelly will go up. Or if you think about if the price of the iPhone goes down, then probably the demand for iPhone apps will go up because more people will be buying iPhones. All right. Changing tastes can cause an increase in demand. So just think about changing consumer tastes. Organic foods, demand for organic foods has skyrocketed because people want to eat organic. People want to eat fresher food, more healthy food. So that's caused an increase in demand. People during COVID, why is there such an increased demand for housing? Well, one of the reasons is that during COVID, people were stuck at home, and a lot of people realized, well, our house is kind of small. Let's get a bigger house. So any kind of changing taste that you can think of would increase demand. Okay, and then changing expectations, such as the expectation of a future price increase or a shortage. So if you think that, think about the housing market right now. The housing market is already, there's already a shortage in the housing market. And what economists are saying now is that now that interest rates are going up, that will decrease supply that will decrease demand, because as interest rates go up, it's going to make a house more expensive to purchase, increase the mortgage payments. So that should kind of calm the housing market down a little bit. In the long run, that's true. But think about it in the short run. What if you were in the market to buy a house right now and you knew interest rates were going up? Aren't you going to want to hurry up and get a house before so you can lock in a lower rate? Well, that's what we're talking about here. The expectation of a future price increase will cause demand to increase. You're going to buy more, you want to buy it before the price increases. So changing expectations like future price increases, or if you think something's going to be a shortage, that can cause an increase in demand. Think about the whole toilet paper shortage during COVID. That was so nonsensical, but it's because people thought they were going to run out of toilet paper, that they weren't going to be able to get it. So they run out and buy it, causes this huge increase in demand. All right, and then an increase in the number of buyers. Simply, if more people are buying a product, that's going to increase, that's going to cause a shift in the demand. Okay, so just to back up here, or to recap, all of these things will cause a shift in the demand curve to the right, an increase in demand. If there's a price increase, if there's an increase in income, that's going to shift the demand curve to the right. If it's a normal good, if you have a decrease in income, so let's say we go into a recession, there's a decrease in income, there's going to be a shift in demand for inferior goods. If the price of a related good goes up, then the demand for the substitute will increase. If there's a decrease in the price of a good, the demand for its complements will increase. If people just through changing taste will demand more of the good, that's going to cause an increase in demand. So changing taste in a positive way, obviously. And changing expectations, like if you think there's going to be a future price increase or a shortage in the future, that'll cause demand to increase. All right, and then an increase in the number of buyers. So think about more people are buying electric cars, that's causing an increase in demand for electric vehicles. Okay, so of course the opposite, if you go through this, the opposite of all these scenarios, of each of these scenarios, will cause a decrease in the demand and the curve to shift to the left. Okay, now let's talk about supply. So I mentioned the law of supply. Law of supply means that as an increase in price is going to cause a quantity supplied to increase. That's a movement along the curve. But what causes a shift in the curve? What causes a change in supply? Well, this is a little more confusing in my opinion, but think about it this way. Anything that decreases producer costs is going to result in an increase in the supply, okay, which is a shift to the right. Okay, so what we're going to talk about here is what causes an increase in supply, which is when that supply curve shifts to the right, meaning more suppliers are coming in and supplying more stuff. Or they're producing more and more suppliers are coming in. So when you have an increase in supply, that means that the whole curve shifts. So more is going to be supplied at each price level, at all price levels. Okay, so the following factors are going to cause an increase in supply. And the way to think about it is if it is going to cause an increase in supply, just ask yourself, will this decrease producer costs? If the answer is yes, that's probably going to mean, then it's typically going to mean an increase in supply. Okay, so let's look at these factors. A decrease in input prices. Okay, if your input prices decrease, your costs are decreasing, right? You're going to produce more. That's an increase in supply. Advances in technology. That advances in technology generally tend to decrease input prices or to decrease employer costs or producer costs. So let me repeat that. Advances in technology generally tend to decrease producer costs. Therefore, advances in technology tend to cause an increase in supply. Expectations about a future price increase. So my battery's about to run out. Let me take a moment to plug this in. All right, stop. Expectations of a future price increase. So think about that. If you're a supplier and you think that prices are going to go up, you're going to produce more because you want to be able to take advantage of that. All right, and then an increase in the number of sellers. If there's more sellers, then that's going to, more people selling the item, then that's going to also increase supply. All right, so just to recap, again, think about anything that decreases supplier costs will probably result in an increase in supply. Here's some things that will cause an increase in supply, which causes the curve to shift to the right: a decrease in input prices, technological advances, expectations of a future price increase. People are going to produce more of that, and an increase in the number of sellers. So this will cause, let's go back to this increase in future prices. That's going to cause more people to produce the good, and because they want to make more profits. So it'll attract more producers. And then simply just by the fact that you're attracting more sellers or more producers, that will increase supply as well. Okay, so now we're going to put both of those curves together and discuss what happens what actually happens when these supply curves shift. All right, so if demand increases, typically demand will increase and then supply will increase. So if demand increases and then supply increases, what happens to price and to quantity? Okay, well, the answer depends. Quantity is always going to increase in this scenario, but the price change depends on the magnitude of the shifts in the curves. So if the shifts in the supply curve and the demand curve are equal, then the price ends up being the same. The quantity produced has increased, or the quantity of demanded has increased, but the price is the same. If the change in demand is greater than the change in supply, then the price ends up being higher. However, if the change in demand is less than the change in supply, then the price ends up being lower. All right, so I'm going to show you all this in a graph to explain it better. So let me stop sharing the screen, and we're going to look at this graph. It's figure 8.4 on page 101, and I've added some hand-drawn labels on it so you can see what I'm talking about. All right, so here we have this demand curve, okay, right here. All right, the original demand curve, and we have the original supply curve. And we're at an equilibrium point right here. Right here. So the price is $8, and the demand is, let's see, the price is $8 and the demand is about $5. Okay, so let's do this. Right, so we're at point A right here. All right, so let's say that our income increases. So our demand for a product shifts. So the demand curve goes here, right here. So we're moving up to point B. This is our new equilibrium. We've gone from point A to point B. So right now, forget about the supply curve. Only the demand curve has shifted. So the demand curve was here, supply was here. We were in equilibrium at point A. Now we have more income now, and so we're demanding more of normal goods. So the new equilibrium is right here. Okay, so so the price has gone up to $11, and the quantity is now $7. You see this? Okay, so typically an increase in demand, a shift in demand, is going to result in a shift in supply. So what I've done here is I have the magnitude, you see the area here? The shift in the demand curve is exactly, let me back up. The shift in the supply curve from here to here is exactly the same as the shift in demand. Okay, so we have a shift in the demand curve, then we have an equal shift in the supply curve. So now more suppliers are supplying whatever product this is as a result of the increase in demand. And so when the supply increases, we come back down here. This is our new equilibrium. This is point C. So what happened here? Well, the price went up here, and then when the supply curve shifted, the price went back down. But with each of these shifts here and here, more is being produced. You have the quantity keeps increasing. The quantity demanded. All right. So anyway, so this is illustrating when the shift in the demand curve is the same as the shift in the supply curve. So you end up with the same price. So it's good for us because there's more products out there, but we're back to the same price. So it was good for us when the supply increased. So here you have, just to repeat, first you have a shift in demand, followed by a shift in supply, the shift in the demand curve, followed by the shift in supply curve, an increase in both. But because the shifts were exactly the same, we end up with the same price as before, original price. Okay, what happens if, and this is typically what happens to in most situations, the demand curve shifts, then the supply curve shifts, but a bunch, let's say it's for soy milk or soy product. Let's say there's a huge increase in demand for soy milk. Well, then all these producers want to make money. So there's a shift in supply. More of these suppliers shift from making whatever they're doing, making regular milk, and they're now making soy milk. So let's say that the shift in supply is way down here. Okay, well, what happens there? If the shift in supply is greater than the shift in demand, then you're going to have much more the quantity increases by much more, but the price goes down. So for us as consumers, that's what we want. We want the shift in supply to be greater than the shift in demand, because that means the price is going to be lower than it was originally. So if the shift in supply is greater than the shift in demand, we end up with a lower price. All right, and then finally, the third scenario, what if the shift in supply is less than the shift in demand? Let's say the supply curve ends up here, then we end up with a higher price than before. Okay, and so what I'm illustrating here, and make sure you understand if you have an increase in demand and then a subsequent increase in supply, what happens to price and what happens to quantity? All right, and there's all kinds of different scenarios you can go over. You can also have, of course, a decrease in demand. You can have a shift where the demand curve, let's do just the opposite. What happens if the demand curve, there's a decrease in demand? So the demand curve shifts, to the left. The demand curve goes down here. If the demand curve goes down here, the price goes down, and then, the price goes down and quantity demanded goes down. But if there's a shift to the left in the demand curve, then that's going to cause a decrease in supply. And then when supply decreases, that causes the price to go up. And so you can draw that scenario too. It's just the opposite. So, the change in the magnitude of, if there's a decrease in supply and a decrease in demand, you're going to have less quantity. The quantity is less, but the change in the price, again, is dictated by the magnitude of the changes in supply and demand. But you can see how, if you just think about products that aren't much in demand anymore. When something is not much in demand anymore, then the supply decreases, and you end up typically probably will pay more, not less. So, okay. So anyway, make sure you understand what these shifts are and how the change in the price and the change in the quantity is affected. But there's all different kinds of scenarios, but the one that I want you to, just make sure you understand is this one that we've gone over here, and that's in the notes. You can think about, the opposite scenario. What if we have a decrease in demand and a subsequent decrease in supply? And then you can also have crazy things happen, like demand decreases and supply increases. That typically doesn't happen, but or you can have demand decreasing and supply increasing and vice versa. But typically you have an increase in demand followed by a subsequent increase in supply, or a decrease in demand followed by a subsequent decrease in supply. Okay, so as I mentioned, this is an important chapter. If you have any questions regarding the chapter, feel free to contact me. Take care.